There is a strip of water on the map that most people never notice. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. It separates Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is only a few dozen kilometers wide. But underneath that narrow water sits half the planet's proven oil reserves. Every ship that leaves the Persian Gulf has to pass through it. Roughly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil and gas on Earth moves through this one channel. That oil fuels Asia's biggest economies. China depends on it. So does Japan. So does India and South Korea. Nearly a third of the world's fertilizer also travels through this strait. And the desert nations of the Gulf import most of their own food through it too. For decades, experts had a simple assumption. They believed Iran would never actually close the strait. The reasoning made sense on paper. Closing it would hurt Iran's own oil exports just as much as everyone else's. It would also invite a massive military response from the United States. So the strait stayed open, year after year, as a kind of fragile truce. Then in 2026, that truce broke. The United States and Israel launched a war against Iran. Regime change was the stated goal. Iran's leadership decided they had nothing left to lose. So they did the thing everyone said they never would. They shut the Strait of Hormuz down. Not with warships or missiles, but with cheap drones, small boats, and naval mines. And it worked. For months, the strait stayed closed. 3 American aircraft carrier groups sat nearby. None of them could fully reopen it. Eventually, the US Navy answered with its own blockade, aimed squarely at Iranian tankers. The global economy took the hit almost immediately. A fifth of the world's oil and gas simply stopped moving. The Gulf states absorbed the worst of the damage. A ceasefire and peace talks eventually followed. But something had changed that no treaty could undo. Iran had learned exactly how much power that narrow strip of water gave it. And every country around the Gulf learned the same lesson. They could never let themselves be this exposed again. 2 nations had already prepared for this moment, decades in advance. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Back in the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were at war with each other. Tankers in the Gulf were getting attacked constantly. So Saudi Arabia built something clever, a pipeline stretching all the way across the country. It started at the oil fields near the Gulf. It ended on the Red Sea coast. They called it the East-West Pipeline. It was built for exactly this kind of crisis. When Hormuz finally closed in 2026, the Saudis switched it on at full capacity. Nearly 7 million barrels a day rerouted around the danger zone. That was almost their entire usual export volume. Iran tried to strike the pipeline with drones and missiles, but most of it runs several feet underground. It is nearly invisible from the air. Explosions overhead barely touch it. Iran managed to hit a few above-ground pumping stations instead. Saudi crews repaired the damage within days each time. The result was striking. The IMF still projected Saudi growth above 3% that year, barely a dent compared to what could have happened. The UAE had its own backup plan too, a pipeline built back in 2012. It runs from the Gulf Coast to the city of Fujairah. Fujairah sits safely outside the strait, on the Gulf of Oman. But this pipeline was smaller than Saudi Arabia's. It could only move about half of the UAE's usual oil exports. The other half simply had nowhere to go during the war. The lesson landed hard in Abu Dhabi. Construction is now underway on a second parallel pipeline. Once finished, it will double the country's export capacity around Hormuz. The target completion date is the end of 2027. When it's done, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE will be almost fully insulated from another closure. Not every Gulf nation had that option. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Iraq share no land route around the strait. They had to rely on their neighbors and improvisation to survive the crisis. The economic gap this created was enormous. Compare Saudi Arabia to Qatar in the same year. Saudi Arabia grew by roughly 3%. Qatar's economy shrank by more than 8%. The difference came down to one thing: geography, and whether a country had a way around the strait. Iraq suffered especially hard. Over 90% of its oil exports normally move through the Gulf. When the strait closed, Iraqi oil production collapsed with it. Engineers scrambled to find any workaround they could. One solution became known, half-jokingly, as the pipeline on wheels. Trucks hauled crude oil from Iraqi Kurdistan across Syrian territory. It ended at a refinery on the Syrian coast. It moved about 200,000 barrels a day. That was only a small fraction of Iraq's normal output. A separate pipeline through Turkey offered a similar trickle. Iraq is now racing to nearly quadruple that pipeline's capacity. During the crisis, one idea went viral online. An entrepreneur suggested trucking oil across the desert to avoid the strait entirely. Critics tore the idea apart almost instantly. The math simply didn't work. Someone calculated the numbers on a public forum. It would take over 50,000 tanker trucks a day to match the strait's usual flow. That means launching a new truck every fraction of a second, non-stop. Lined up end to end, those trucks would stretch across the desert twice over. The empty quarter of Arabia has almost no roads to support that. Building that kind of infrastructure overnight was never realistic. Trucking could save food imports. It could never replace oil at scale. One place did absorb a genuine shift during the war. A port called Corfachan on the UAE's Gulf of Oman coast. Before the war, it mostly handled ship-to-ship container transfers. Only about 100 trucks left the port each day. Once Hormuz closed, everything changed. Ships from Europe, Asia, and Africa began unloading there instead. Trucks carried goods overland into the Gulf states. Daily truck traffic jumped from 100 to over 7,000. Weekly container movement rose from 2,000 to 50,000. In a sense, the region rebuilt its ancient desert caravan routes. It was enough to keep food and consumer goods flowing. It was never going to be enough for oil. Qatar faces its own unique problem. It is the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas. Every drop of that gas has always sailed out through Hormuz. There is no pipeline alternative in place today. Building one means picking a difficult partner. A pipeline could run through the UAE toward Fujairah or Oman, or it could run the long way through Saudi Arabia toward the Mediterranean. Either path means expensive new liquefaction plants outside the Gulf. Either path also means depending on a rival. Qatar spent years under a blockade enforced by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, from 2017 to 2021. Trusting either country with its only escape route is not an easy decision, but without one, Qatar remains completely exposed to Iran. For decades, one country blocked the most obvious solution of all, Syria. Syria sits directly between the Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. Under the Assad family, Syria aligned closely with Iran and Russia. Its territory was closed off to Western pipeline projects for generations. History made that closure even more permanent. A pipeline once called Tapline carried Saudi oil across Syria toward Lebanon. Israel later took control of part of its route during the Golan Heights conflict. The pipeline became a repeated target of sabotage. It was fully shut down by 1976. A second pipeline once connected Iraq's oil fields to the Syrian coast. It was bombed during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Assad's government shut it completely in 1982. American forces struck what remained of it during the 2003 Iraq invasion. It has never reopened since. Even a proposed Qatar to Europe gas pipeline through Syria died on paper. Russia pressured Damascus to abandon the plan in 2011. Months later, Syria's civil war erupted and buried the idea for over a decade. The Assad regime finally collapsed near the end of 2024. A new government took power in Damascus. For the first time in half a century, Syria's geography is back on the table. Syria's new president has proposed reviving an old idea, sometimes called the Four Seas Plan. The vision links the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Caspian, and the Black Sea. Roads, railways, and pipelines would tie them all together. Some pieces are already moving. The wartime oil trucking route from Iraq is still running today. An old gas pipeline is again carrying Egyptian gas into southern Syria. A newer pipeline now carries Azerbaijani gas from Turkey into the north. Talks are underway for a long-discussed Qatar to Syria gas pipeline. There is renewed interest in resurrecting the old Tapline route as well. A separate plan would restore the historic Kirkuk-Banias oil pipeline from Iraq. Sanctions on Syria have been significantly eased to help make this possible. Major energy companies have already signed early agreements with Syria's new government. Plans are even in motion to rebuild Syria's shattered rail network. One proposal would revive the century-old Hejaz Railway, connecting Arabia to the Mediterranean. Saudi officials have floated turning part of it into a high-speed line. None of this comes cheap. Rebuilding Syria to its pre-war condition could cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Restoring the railways alone could cost billions more. Security remains a serious concern. Remnants of ISIS and Iran-backed militias still operate in parts of the country. Protecting a pipeline through empty desert territory is no small task. There's another problem too. Most of the Gulf's oil and gas doesn't even flow toward Europe anymore. It flows east, toward Asia, and that trend keeps growing. A route to Syria mainly serves the opposite direction of where demand is rising. Still, the strategic value may outweigh the economic one. Iran won a real victory during the 2026 war. It proved it could hold the world's energy supply hostage. It proved that even the US military couldn't force the strait back open. But victories can be temporary. Every pipeline built around Hormuz chips away at that leverage. Every new port, every new railway, every new route does the same. If the Gulf states, Europe, and the United States keep building these alternatives, the balance of power shifts. Iran may have won this crisis, but it could lose the peace that follows. The next time tensions rise in the region, Iran may find its greatest weapon has quietly been taken away. And this time, it will be Iran negotiating from a position of weakness.